I'm Nandini. It's a really, really exciting time in this industry right now to geek out about the direction of voice and speech recognition technology. So because I'm a user-centered designer, I like to first do my favorite thing is to kind of poll the audience and see how many of you think that in a few years we'll all be talking to everything around us. Okay, and that was ambiguous, so if I say 5 years from now, and how about 100 years from now? Okay. As we explore the potential for this technology and what our future holds for us, it's important to first understand how this technology sort of came to where it is today and how it's developed and honor how people's impressions of it have been shaped. So people's behavior toward any interface that emulates human conversation is shaped by three things. How they imagined it was supposed to work, based on what sci-fi has promised us, how they've actually experienced them working, and how they innately expect them to work. We're going to unpack a few of those things together. So first of all, for the better part of a century, sci-fi has taught us to picture a future where we can carry on seamless conversations with the robots and other things around us. But to help illustrate just how close we are to what's been imagined, let's go back 43 years and hear what one of our most iconic sci-fi writers has had to say. No. I knew that would happen. Sorry. It's worth it, I promise. Thank you. Okay, reset. If it doesn't work, unplug it and try it again. That's how technology works.
I brought along my son Jonathan, who in the year 2001 will be the same age as I am now. Maybe he will be better adjusted to this kind of world that you're trying to portray.
The big difference when he grows up, in fact, if we wanted to wait for the year 2001, is that he will have in his own house, not a computer as big as this, but at least a console through which he can talk to his friendly local computer and get all the information he needs for his everyday life, like his bank statements, his theater reservations, all the information you need in the course of living in a complex modern society. This will be in a compact form in his own house. He'll have a television screen like these here and a keyboard, and he'll talk to the computer and get information from it, and he'll take it as much for granted as we take the telephone.
I wonder, though, what sort of a life would it be like in social terms? I mean, if our whole life is built around the computer, that we become a computer-dependent society and computer-independent individuals?
In some ways, but they'll also enrich our society because it'll make it possible for us to live really anywhere we like. Any businessman, any executive could live almost anywhere on Earth and still do his business through a device like this. And this is a wonderful thing. It means we wanted to be stuck in cities, we better live out in the country or wherever we please, and still carry on complete interaction with human beings as well as with other computers.
Who knows who that was? Shout it out. Arthur C. Clarke, author of 2001: A Space Odyssey. A little bit prophetic, right? Kind of describes what I do on a daily basis now. I felt for a while that voice interfaces were going to be the primary mode of interaction in the future, but I also thought we'd be a lot further along by now. I didn't watch a lot of sci-fi as a kid or a lot of television. I grew up in a very sheltered, kind of cult-like atmosphere where media was bad, and I only started to discover it when I was a little older. But I did love Star Trek. I loved Star Trek Voyager when it was on, and I was convinced 20 years ago that Jerry Ryan would play me in the movie edition of my life. Personally, sci-fi, it might have captured my imagination early on, but it was my experience as a user in need of speech recognition technology and speech synthesis technology that I came to believe in it and have dedicated my life to making it better for users. It started at about 17 years ago At the time, I was not a designer yet. I was a technical writer, and I was tasked with doing a technical product guide that would be basically explain what this technology is for the layperson, to basically put the salespeople and the engineers building it kind of on the same ground, common ground, so that they could explain it to and customers, the benefits to customers, and sell it. Unfortunately, those were, at the time, those telephony applications that everyone now loves to hate. And so I got a few things out of that experience. One is I have a nerve issue anyway, and so I have a hand tremor. It's gotten worse as I've gotten older, but at the time it was aggravated by all this work, writing this guide and all this mouse work. So my boss at the time installed this software on my computer that could overlay on the desktop, and I could use voice recognition to write the document about voice recognition. And it was terrible. It didn't work very well. It was really flawed, and it felt socially awkward to open up AOL Instant Messenger, that was a thing at the time, on my desktop with people around me. So there are all kinds of flaws, but I learned at that very early in my career at that stage that this technology is something that could particularly help people, could be potentially life-altering for people who need it. So then, that was 17 years ago, and then I spent my career creating interfaces at the same time as the technology was sort of trying to keep up, and I was trying to create great experiences. But then I was reminded again as a user about 2 years ago when I was diagnosed with a very rare form of oral cancer with a tumor wrapped around my lingual gland. And that, what needed to happen was, I'm fine, I'm here today to talk about it, but what I learned, what that meant was the entire lower left floor of my mouth had to be removed. That's like the least gross picture, so don't Google this. I had to search pretty far back for a handwritten drawing to find something. So don't Google it. Just trust me, it's fine. But part of what we don't realize is, well, first of all, we've evolved to have 2 of everything, so that's good. But this whole part includes the lingual nerve, the sublingual gland, and a few other essential parts that turn out to be critical for swallowing, producing saliva, and pronouncing certain sounds, especially those needing some tongue strength, like the name of my own employer. So anyway, I'm fine. It was a skill set, and what I want to emphasize is that that's another type of speech technology that can be developed to help users, is to talk on behalf of us. So these are 2 kind of key different entities. So that was me as a user, and then as a designer, I faced a very real kind of existential crisis that comes with trying to explain what I do for a living at cocktail parties or on the airplane, designing speech interfaces for the telephone because they were phone systems that people love to hate. So for years, I sort of faced this question. Then I decided to work at Google, and it's a lot easier to answer that question. I can just say, I work at Google, and then full stop. But for those of you who don't work in the industry, I have a quick 30-second background of what the technology is, but I'll get to that in a second. Because let's be honest, right now, most user interfaces are a long way off, but there's a reason for that. The phone systems that were out there were largely involuntary interactions. They're called IVRs, interactive voice response systems, are market differentiators for service, but they're not something consumers elect to buy, not that I know of. So people come up with, people have kind of visceral reactions to these. They have a different way they react to something that it's more of a push than a pull of the technology, and that's sort of how it's evolved. But what happens is those feelings that people have tried to connect and try to come up with that they have in that moment, they don't know what to do with them. They end up being directed at the company that they're dealing with or at the technology itself. So it's really influenced how people perceive. So it's important to understand that there's, now we're shifting into more, like a little bit more of an intimate type of way people interact with this technology. People buy devices that can do this now, so it's shifted. Also, the technology used in voice interaction, a lot of times have been portrayed by science fiction as sort of synonymous with artificial intelligence. They're not the same, but in our 2017 reality, we're starting to actually see some of these concepts converge. However, conversations and how we communicate from human to human are really hard to codify. Developing the technology to the point where we could understand strings of text of what people say and take it and do something with it, we've made it pretty far to get to that point. And now the challenge is, how do we actually do something with that that's meaningful and that we can interpret? So here's that quick 30-second background.
The first speech recognition system was developed by Bell Laboratories in 1952. It could only recognize numbers spoken by one person. In the 1970s, Carnegie Mellon came out with the Harpy system, which was able to recognize over 1,000 words and could recognize different pronunciations of the same word.
Tomato.
Tomato.
Speech recognition continued in the 80s with the introduction of the hidden Markov model, which used a more mathematical approach to analyzing sound waves and led to many of the breakthroughs we have today.
So it takes a lot of things working together to make a single turn dialogue in a dialogue successful. So you can't design, first of all, in isolation of that. You have to be aware of the underlying technology and account for it at the same time. So the good thing is that part, it's working better than ever. So now we have to worry a lot less about what the computer getting that string of text than what the user getting that string of text users say wrong, and more about what to do with it. So designing for voice is now much more about what's between the user and let's just call it a black box of what the recognizer is doing. Instead, we need to focus more on what the user's intent is and what's in between. What is that interface? That's when things start to get really interesting. Designing for, so why, first of all, do we want to talk to stuff to begin with? To understand that, we first need to understand why and how we talk to people. If we were observing that the expectations for computerized speech recognition go back less than a century, remember that people's expectations for how language and conversation work go back a couple 100,000 millennia. And this is just a very conservative estimate. This isn't even considering how much we've, again, physically evolved to be able to speak, but the actual development of spoken language and how we use it and all the conventions that we use in our daily conversation that we're so innately root to how we communicate that they are subconscious. There's a reason for this. Conversing only seems easy because it's familiar. It's the conversational interface that we know, and as humans, is what we learn first, and it's what we know best. What the scientists will tell you is that this is the tricky part. If we can figure this part out, that's the challenge.
Our ability to use language is one of the things that helps us have culture. It's one of the things that helps us pass on traditions from one generation to another. Figuring out about how the system of language works, even though that seems like a really easy problem, turns out to be one that's really hard, but that every baby has cracked by the time they're 2 years old.
There's 2 L's.
There's 2 L's, yeah. E-L-L-I, and then E.
Language is extremely complex and sophisticated.
From the semantics,
irony,
strong accents,
facial expressions,
human emotion, because that's part of how we communicate.
humor.
Do I have to be careful not to offend the dinosaur?
Language has so many different layers, and that's why it's such a difficult problem.
At present, the human brain and the learning algorithms in the human brain are far, far better at things like language understanding, and they're still a lot better at pattern recognition.
So whether or not we replicate exactly what the brain does to understand language and to understand speech is still a question.
So what happens when it doesn't work? Well, the interesting thing about Star Trek is, first let's talk about the fact that not all the observed expectations, or what we saw, they did only what the writers can come up with. And so, first of all, how many people have heard like interfaced with, called one of the phone companies or have an Alexa or have interfaced with any kind of voice recognition technology? And how many have never encountered something to the effect of, I'm sorry, I did not understand? We don't, that's awesome that you have not encountered that. So here's what it looks like. So from once in a while, you would see that it didn't work in Star Trek.
Tomato soup.
There are 14 varieties of tomato soup available from this replicator, with rice, with vegetables, Bolian style, with pasta, with
Plain.
Specify hot or chilled.
Hot. Hot, plain tomato soup. 14 varieties and they can't even get plain tomato soup right.
I sort of have this suspicion, that was the very first episode of that show, I sort of had this suspicion that they got together and they wrote that and they said, yeah, that's kind of what this technology is supposed to do. And then someone said, look, we're talking about the future here, like 400 years in the future. Maybe we could come up with something more. But it's worth calling out that the sci-fi portrayal, particularly on Star Trek, we usually got to see people who were hyper-trained, Starfleet personnel who knew exactly what to say. They had the decoder ring for how to interface with this technology. You hardly ever saw like ordinary people interacting, and when you did, it was probably something more like this.
Please enter program.
The android at the bar said you could show me my old ship. Let me see it.
Insufficient data. Please specify parameters.
The Enterprise. Show me the bridge of the Enterprise, you chattering piece of...
There have been 5 Federation ships with that name. Please specify by registry number.
NCC 1701. No bloody A, B, C, or D.
Program complete. Enter when ready.
That starts to feel a little bit more familiar, right, to what you've tried to interface with. So I asked a general slice of the population last year what they thought about whether they used the technology and how they felt about it and how they made them feel. And one key question I was exploring was, when it doesn't work, how does that make you feel in that moment? And I concluded that, well, almost half have like a negative, deep, visceral reaction, and almost 40% are liars. So the fact is that designing for a spoken dialogue between a human and computer in advance, accounting for all the possibilities, both in function and user behavior, and still have it feel natural, is a lot harder than it looks. So to help do that, we recommend stopping and appreciating the problem space. Appreciate the fact that conversation has underlying rules and conventions that we've developed over this long period of time that we innately know to be true, but we can't always codify so easily. So there's a few parallels in other industries. We can all drive, but we can't all be mechanics. We know how gravity works, but we can't necessarily design something and account for it being safe when something falls in a piece of machinery. So spoken dialogue has specific rules and conventions. So let's look at a typical conversation structure broken into 6 parts. Meaning is negotiated through language. So it has to come through all of these things happening together. So first of all, a conversation starts with one participant opening a channel saying, I want to engage with you. And so it might be saying something, tapping on the shoulder. Conversation starts, one participant initiates it. Then the other person has to commit to engaging. They have to say something or just stop what they're doing and giving you eye contact. So now they're engaged. Next, that's when you start to construct meaning. And here's when it starts to get interesting. And that what I explained about how we can understand what people are saying but what they mean and all the underlying context and shared cultural references and all the things that we put together to construct meaning, most of that is unspoken. We don't say it out loud. Next, any kind of conversation, no matter what it is, will evolve in some way. You'll take some nugget of information with you and change you in some way. And then you need to converge on some sort of agreement and negotiate that meaning into something. This is usually when some repair is needed. So and technologists call it error handling, but in conversation there aren't really errors. They're just misalignments of meaning, and people need to put those together and share. So I urge you, like for the rest of the day, even just for another hour or two, try to pay attention when you're conversing with someone, no matter who it is, and pay attention for when you slightly get off track and you have to sort of correct yourself. And then a conversation needs some sort of closure. You act or you transact. Maybe you're just slightly less lonely than you were a minute ago, but you've done something to do some closure. People need that in order to feel closure, and that's something that needs to be incorporated into an interface. So, voice brings with it speed, simplicity, hands-free experiences that become like overly complicated easily when they're based on another mode of interaction. And here's where when you start and you think might go into this field and you might want to do something that's adapting some sort of visual interface and add voice to it. So the key thing to first stop and ask yourself is, voice can't replace something else. There's a reason we're not all just talking on the telephone without any interface. So I'm going to give you 4 tips on like the kinds of use cases to make for the best use cases for voice. But just to frame it in your mind, stop and think about if you texted, think about someone you've texted with or that you do frequently, and think of 2 different scenarios. First, think of conversations that you started in text, going back and forth. You're not on the phone with each other, but you started in text, and how many times you get like multi-threads going or things you have to clarify. Maybe you start adding visual elements. There's all kinds of things you might add to it. But when something really disconnects and you're like, we're not kind of connecting, how many of you have stopped and go like, oh, I'm just going to pick up the phone and call, or I'll just explain it in person? Because spoken language solves some problems that friction that would otherwise have a lot of friction when all you have to go by is a visual interface, even if it's mimicking conversation. Now, take the reverse side of it. If you're having a phone conversation with someone, first just think just a phone conversation where you don't have any visual element. Think of a phone conversation when you've had with someone. Maybe you're in the store, or you're going to you're talking to your spouse or someone while you're at the store to sort of describe something, and then maybe at some point you're like, you got to see this. You send a picture to enhance that experience, so then they're looking at the same thing. How many of you have done that? So that's like introducing visuals to enhance that experience. That's because I guess the last thing to consider is if you're talking to someone else on the phone, how many of you have said like, we'll just talk in person? And then when you talk in person, there's so many other elements you add to it, right? So that's because when we talk, just like I could have, I guess, done this whole thing with just audio, but that wouldn't have been very interesting. But you see my facial expressions, you see my hand gestures. There are things visually that enhance that experience, but fundamentally, you're hearing me speak. And most of what you're getting is hopefully from what I'm saying, and not necessarily, I could have done this completely without slides, right? So visuals add to the experience, but spoken language is still the core center of the experience of how we communicate with each other. So users make conscious trade-offs, and the thing I want you to think about as you consider different use cases is that oftentimes it's not about an entire app or an entire business case that you're translating into voice, but it's context-driven. What makes sense for one thing might not make sense for another. So things that make for good voice interfaces is anything that's asking something of the user that they already know off the top of their heads. Their own personal information, how many people are going to be there for a reservation. Things people can answer readily are great in voice. Also, quick, compelling, useful tasks, stuff with a big payoff. So again, let's take an example of, say, one of the ride-sharing programs like Lyft or Uber, where maybe if you're trying to do something really complex and you're like not near your home and you need to sort of pin the thing on a very careful, that's not really great for voice. But if you're just trying to get your kid out the door and your hands are full, you've got stuff, and you just want to use a voice command to quickly get something that easily and fast, that's great. It removes friction. Other convenient actions might involve looking up answers or doing quick calculations or logging, tracking information, things like that, where it's just easier to just say it and just ask than to have to pull out your phone and go through that. So answering questions on homework or anything like that. My kids like to use it to settle arguments. Another is that some things are just inherently better suited for voice around the home because people want to multitask. They want to be able to do things at the same time as they're consuming information. Voice is a great way to do that, to enable you to do things at the same time, or typically things you want to do hands-free. Or when you just want to have your hands on more important things and to do more in your life that matter, and that maybe you don't want to have your technology or a screen in front of you. So once you hone in on what makes for good use cases for voice, and how do you then design something people want to use, ultimately it's because people are not, again, comparing to sci-fi when they expect interactions to work a certain way. They're subconsciously comparing to humans, and that's a tall order. But there are some shortcuts. So first of all, people have expectations about a voice. As soon as you introduce a voice, people will attribute core attributes to that voice, and they'll put a face or they'll come up with some persona for that voice, whether you plan for it or not. So we really recommend that you consciously define what that voice is, because every voice has an owner and people will ascribe something to it. We instinctively react to interactions with machines like the same psychosocial responses when we react to other people. But also our propensity to anthropomorphize, even when there's no voice there, is really, really strong. Users will perceive some sort of persona. We want to connect, we want to see personality in everything. And this is just so ingrained that it's part of who we are. We want to connect. We don't want technology to sort of be in the way. And so personas also will help you design and write your conversation. So you choosing one early, and when you're trying to create some sort of interface, I really recommend you start there. Start by creating it doesn't even have to be something that is portrayed by an actor or that has a name or anything like that. Even if your user would never even see what this persona is, defining it will really put guardrails on how you build out something like that. Also, consider the fact that the visual signal and the auditory signal are very different things. So when you're designing for voice, one of the key differences is that, especially for something like the Google Home or Alexa, where there is no screen, there's nothing for you to go by, it's inextricably linked with time. You have to hear one word before you hear the next word, before you hear the next word. So all of the only way around that is to consider that all the dialogue, conventions of dialogue and conversation are the same as any other design field. They're critical, they're just different. So here's the thing about Star Trek and other sci-fi. It was never about the technology. Yes, the setting is space, and it's set in the future, but the adventure, the exploration, was never really about the gadgets or the machines. It was about exploring what it means to be human. And the fantastical technology they used, like universal translators, warp speed, and voice commands, they made those connections possible. They just invented technology to make those things possible. Can't go to the other side of the galaxy, warp speed. Can't understand the new culture language that we just met, universal translator. They came up with these things to remove those barriers and gave us some sort of picture into what we could do with technology. So our ability to communicate with each other is at the core of how we've evolved. So the core thing that I'm passionate about is about how voice can be an enabling technology that makes lives easier, not harder. That it's a technology that removes barriers. So to indulge me for a second, if I asked you to apply the 80-20 rule to this. So 80-20 rule is often misused. It's an excuse for designing for the 80% as the majority and maybe dismissing the 20% as trivial. But in actuality, one of the originators of this principle, Dr. Joseph Duran, pointed out that it's the vital few and the trivial many with the principle that 20% of a set of is generally responsible for 80% of a related result. That later became known as Pareto's principle or the 80-20 rule. But regardless of the origins, the value of this rule is reminding us to stay on the focus of the 20% that matters, because that's what it means to be accessible. There's an oversimplification of what that means. If you take, okay, what's 20%? Take 100 people, and let's neatly look at what's 20% of those people, and let's design for those. But this requires, as designers and as industrialists and as technologists, to stop and think about how to humanize it a little bit and realize that you're not designing, again, for 20% use cases. You're designing for cases that, again, it's not necessarily people with disabilities or who need that technology to do what they want to do. It's they're all among us. So maybe you don't really have a mobility problem usually with your hands, but maybe you want to hold your baby while you're walking up the stairs and use your voice to turn off the light. Or maybe you want to pay attention to cooking dinner or talk to that person on the other side of the counter when you're making a doctor's appointment instead of stopping, pulling out your phone, making up an appointment, and filling in all those details when you could stay connected to that person, look them in the eye, and continue connecting with them, and instead quickly voice that appointment, or maybe it captures it automatically someday in the future. That's what's key, is that the context of those 20% are all over us, all over and all around us. And so that's 1 in 5 people. But being accessible and removing barriers from people's lives isn't something that, again, is a concession to the disabled. It's making us all able to connect. Because we know that 1 out of 5 people has some sort of disability, but we also know that 5 out of 5 people want to communicate. They want to play, to share, to find information, and to enjoy the benefits of all our newest technological advances. So it's not about so let's step back from the way people are using technology now. It's not about being voluntary or involuntary. It's not going from trying to drive usage toward a certain scenario. And it's way beyond that. And it's not even about being accessible. Like Star Trek taught us, when you remove all barriers for everyone, authentic connections can happen. This is a very difficult problem. We've started at Google to put a lot of resources out there for anyone to develop, because we think innovation in this area should be about designing great experiences that put the users first. And I'm responsible for this design site where I'm starting with resources that just give people a really good foundation in this. And I encourage you to check it out. Feel free to reach out to me. We've created an open platform for others to create unique and quality user experiences. And when you remove friction and you make things easier for people, they become automatic habits. Thank you very much.